panel, which will be moderated by Jay Taylor.
I was afraid most of you might not recognize me without the hat, so now you're officially watching me take it off.
Somebody get a camera.
Yeah, the sunglasses from the glare, I understand, yeah. Okay. Welcome to the panel. I wanted to talk today about standards today, regulations tomorrow, and what we see from the constituencies, how this looks as it moves forward. One of the things I wanted to do is introduce or have introduced the folks who are on the panel. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And Colette, if you would start us, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Colette Maloney. I work with the European Commission in Brussels. I don't know if everybody's heard of us, but we're basically the legislative arm of the European Union. And the particular responsibility is ICT and sustainability. Is that enough?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm John Calhoun from Microsoft. I work in our corporate standards group. I focus on cloud computing and green IT standards.
Chris Hankin with ITI. ITI is a trade association based in Washington, D.C. About 50 companies who comprise the membership. ITI has a formal MOU with the Green Grid, essentially with us serving as an advocacy arm to the work that the Green Grid does. The role that I take on is as the Senior Director for Energy and Sustainability Policy. Essentially, I'm a DC policy wonk. I've been working in DC for 30 some odd years, involving the high-tech industry and its relations with government and vice versa.
I'm Alex Bosenberg. I'm the Manager of Regulatory Affairs for the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. NEMA is a 450-member company trade association based in Rosslyn, Virginia. Mostly commercial heavy industry products, but we do have a power electronics section, which includes backup power supplies and things like that. I work with Jay as one of the leaders in that section. And I focus on Department of Energy rulemakings for minimum product efficiency standards, minimum appliance efficiency standards, as they call it. I also represent member interests to the Federal Trade Commission regarding labeling of products and member involvement. I facilitate member involvement in the Energy Star program for those of our products which are covered, about 6 or 7 of the Energy Star programs, to include the emerging data centers, which we'll talk about more this afternoon later.
Thank you. And my name is Jay Taylor. I'm the Director for Global Standards, Codes, and Environment for Schneider Electric. I'm also a member of the Green Grid. I work with John in the SC39 organization. I'm the chair for SC39. And I get to work with Chris and I get to work with Alex in different issues that address IT efficiency in the marketplace. So if you look, I borrowed this slide. My colleagues at the Energy Star program were kind enough to lend it to me. These are a listing of local benchmarking or local voluntary programs that exist in the United States. And you'll notice that there's a lot of cities involved, but there's also a fair number of states involved. And after all, why would you be collecting all of this information in voluntary programs either at the city level or at the state level unless you're going to do something with it eventually? Then what I started doing was listing different programs which are occurring across the nations. We have the Global Harmonization of Metrics activity, which is currently between the EU, the US, and Japan, but it's growing. There are more countries becoming involved. We also have a data center standard that's been generated out of Singapore. We have embedded carbon regulations showing up in Australia, and we'll see those regulations start to move in other locations as they look at how the construct of the regulation occur. And then finally, in the European Union, we've got a Lot X for servers, Lot 27 for UPS systems, which has just started down the road. And we've had the EU Data Center Code of Conduct, which we were talking about yesterday in our data center maturity model conversation about how we were lining up the data center maturity model with the EU Code of Conduct. So all of these things preface a lot of activity that's going on in the marketplace trying to define what environmental sustainability is, what is IT's role in this sustainability model. So we have also a number of organizations which are heavily involved in data center development, data center standards development. Besides the Green Grid, my colleagues at ASHRAE, which also are liaisons to the Green Grid, the Energy Star program for data centers, JTC1 SC39, JTC1's SC38, which is working on cloud computing environment, the IEC's Strategy Management Board, SG4, which is talking about DC in buildings, but also data centers, which is a target, and then ITUT Study Group 5. So when you look at these entities, all of them are headed down the path of generating standards which fill up areas that allow us to universally apply these requirements globally. So with that, what I'm going to ask my colleagues here to do is to give a description of how their particular segment is addressing these standards and where do they believe they're going to lead into the future. And I'll let you start.
Me, okay. Can I just start with some general words as well? Yeah. It's just as background to the work that we're doing in Europe. Europe has set climate and energy targets for 2020. They're called the energy climate target, the 2020 targets, because what we're actually trying to do is to reduce carbon emissions by 20% by 2020 compared to 1990 levels, to improve energy efficiency by 20% by 2020 compared to 2005 levels, and to increase the share of renewable energy to 20% of total energy by 2020. So those are the three targets we set ourselves for 2020. And we're doing fine, actually, on carbon emissions, and we're doing well on renewable energy, but where we're falling back is on energy efficiency. And that I think is why we have our eye today on data centers. And not actually, if I can broaden that, on the ICT industry in general. And back in 2009, I think it was, we started looking, more closely at the ICT industry, and particular with a view to get a number on the energy footprint and on the carbon footprint. And we saw that there were there's a lot of work going on to address that. There were many organizations, SDOs, developing standards to measure it. And what we did is we spoke to the main bodies, like the ITU, like the IEC, like ETSI, and we got them to work together, actually, and to make sure that the work they were doing was consistent. And they came up with these methodologies, L1410, L1420, and we actually piloted them with a whole bunch of IT companies last year, just to see how well they work. And we've published the results of those pilot tests on the web, so anybody can see those. But now we're taking a closer look at data centers, and indeed we are following the SC39 work. And I think our main interest, again, is seeing as much harmonization as possible. Our real interest in the SC39 work really is getting indicators that are useful to government bodies. There's various things, of course, we can do with those indicators. We can stick them into legislation, which is more complicated than it sounds. We can encourage voluntary agreements, and we can also try and promote them in procurement. So that's the kind of stuff that we have in mind. We're not doing all of the work ourselves, at least my own part of the commission, but a lot of work is actually being done in addition to the work being done on the Code of Conduct by the JRC, Paolo Bertoldi and his people. We have a few things, with respect to data centers, we're looking at two things. If I broaden that out, it's basically data centers themselves, but we're also looking at data center services and to see if also for services as well as to the infrastructure, it makes sense to develop indicators. Is that enough for now to get it started?
Thanks. John?
So I'll give you my perspective, mostly from the U.S. ICT, or I say IT industry. Our brethren in the communication side have a few different opinions on some of the specifics, but we certainly, my observation is that we definitely support a voluntary system of improvement. We also believe that innovation is profoundly important to making progress on just about any problem. And we also believe in competition in the marketplace. Probably one of the things that we don't recognize quite so well is more need for cooperation. I don't think it's any secret in the U.S. that companies really go at it in the marketplace, and everybody's always looking for the number one spot. I think one of the things that we have to pursue more is more cooperation to make progress on some of these important issues like energy efficiency of data centers and sustainability overall. And certainly standards is a place where that cooperation happens. You bring a lot of different opinions together, a lot of different agendas, but you come to a common spot, a published specification at some point, and anybody that's ever read one of these understands that it is a compromise of ideas and sometimes ideals. But we believe that the voluntary standard system works very well. We like the multi-path approach in the U.S. where lots of organizations can come to the table and form standards, and the marketplace can pick the ones that are most important to them. I'm really interested in Ms. Maloney's approach as a European representative of the regulatory body there. What they have to say, what EPA has to say, what agencies in China have to say is very important to us, and one of the things that we definitely think about in SC 39 and ITS 39, which is the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to that body. We want to make sure that the things that we develop are useful to customers. They're useful to our colleagues in government, and they're useful to vendors. So we're looking for that sort of triple win out of the standards and regulatory mix.
Thanks, John. Chris?
One of the interesting things to watch at ITI over the last, say, 5 years has been the activity that the membership has wanted to be carried out by the team that I'm part of, which is the Energy and Environment Sustainability team. It used to be, 5-6 years ago, focused primarily on U.S. governmental activity, the state and federal level, with primary focus on hazardous materials and e-waste. That's evolved, and it's evolved because of pressure from the membership to become much more active internationally, and with a great deal more focus also on energy efficiency. That resulted last year in a team of, a small team, and I'm trying to think who was on it. I think Henry was involved, Rona certainly, some others here, as we tried to come up with a set of principles to take to governments overseas, as well as in the U.S., as to the principles that we thought should apply on energy efficiency regulation, be it a voluntary program or a mandatory requirement or MEPS. The emphasis was around harmonization, and not just standards themselves, but also the definitions to those standards, the interpretations to those standards, the testing to carry out looking at those standards. And so a real emphasis that we've tried to take overseas on PCs, imaging equipment, servers, up into data centers is around the need for harmonization. And I guess my sense of the companies that I represent is a sense that it's not a question of whether regulation's coming, it is. It's a question of whether we can engage on standards and with governments in a way that ensures that those regulations are harmonized in a way that there's not chaos. And so that's how I see my job, is to help with that. We've had some interesting discussions as we get into the question of regulation or voluntary programs involving data centers and their components. One of those is a conversation that actually we took to Gina McCarthy, who now has been nominated to be the head of EPA. And that is a recognition that we needed to have to get out of just talking about the next version of a spec at Energy Star, and step back and do more of a road mapping conversation. One, because there was not that kind of conversation going on, so there was a distrust. We didn't know where they were trying to head, they didn't know where we were trying to head. Second, we needed to bring other stakeholders into that conversation as we did this. What's the vision? But also, I think a fundamental part of it, and data centers are a key part of this, was a conversation as to the fact that Energy Star and a lot of the other programs globally are focused on the component. And that the data center raises a fundamental problem or challenge for regulators in that respect. One, as you try to look at how you would regulate the data center itself, and can you look at the server by itself, or the storage, or the network equipment, or is it far more relevant to look at the system as a whole, which is not the way that Energy Star is normally operated. And then second, how do you take into account in Energy Star the fact that we have moved to a world where items aren't by themselves anymore. Even the dryer or the washer, maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe networked somehow into some kind of home energy management system. How do you build into Energy Star a recognition of the importance of the network, the fact that you want to encourage the efficiencies that the network brings you, and as part of that, a recognition that that's not going to operate without the data center. So there's actually advantages to overall efficiency brought about through the data center. Is there a way that Energy Star and these other programs can adapt to that, or do they just throw up their hands and give up? And Rona actually headed up one of the conversations we had that was just around how do you deal with the systems, and we had a good conversation. I don't know if we came up with solves, but it was a good conversation, which was a key part actually of what we were trying to achieve. Maybe I'll stop there because I've used up my time.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Chris. Alex?
No, thank you. I do a lot of the same job that Chris does, so I'll try not to cover the things he's already said. Excellent points. But so I come also from a standards development organization and an advocacy body for industry. My job, as I said, is to directly interface with government after first working with my members to figure out what the industry opinion is. And so I've been doing that for 2 years, and there's lots of ways to positively affect regulations, and the earlier the better. And so I've titled my 5 minutes, Doom and Gloom and How to Prevent It. And one of the ways we seek to positively influence regulation, whether it is a DOE federal minimum or a voluntary program like Energy Star. Let's face it, if you want to make sales, you need to be Energy Star compliant. So how do you early on get into that? Well, the first thing is you do is you volunteer and you participate in those standards activities, because standards get written by those who show up. That was told to me tongue-in-cheek my first day at NEMA 5 years ago, but after managing 100 standards and white papers in my previous position there as the Lighting Systems Division Technical Program Manager, it rang very true. You can't do anything if people aren't willing to donate their time. Sometimes it's someone's job, and that's handy. It's Jay's job to work with me, and that's nice, but smaller companies or private entities often have to take time away from other things, and it's very understandable, but if you see the positive effects or the potential to positively affect your industry in the future by participating in those standards activities, I hope you'll take that time. So Jay's already given a list of some of the stuff up there. It's on the board, and I would say NEMA is involved in ASHRAE 90.1 through various members in our product sections that are on that committee or those committees. We also provide input through our members into Green Grid. NEMA are also members of the eMERGE Alliance, which talks about DC buildings and other energy efficiency programs like that. So those are some of the things that my colleagues do. But when it gets to me, what we're doing is working with the government, trying to find that compromise so that the regulations or the programs that come about, as John said, have a level playing field and promote and maintain the potential for competition in the marketplace and the capitalist market. We don't like to see regulations that commoditize a product by so strictly defining its performance that there's really only one way to solve it. And so how do you do that with standards? Well, the way to do it is to keep it in mind when you're writing the standard. Anything you put into a standard, sort of like the Miranda rights, can and will be used against you in a regulation later. And so it's worth bearing in mind, how will someone who isn't in the industry read this standard and interpret it? A very relevant example to NEMA is we've been having to go back and help the government understand the motors regulations so that the government test lab that does enforcement and verification testing knows how to test a motor. Motor manufacturers know how to test a motor. They build them every day. And they know how to take a partial motor and slap an end plate and some bearings on it and test it and feel that confidently from one manufacturer to the next they get the same answer. The government lab didn't know how to do that. We had to write it down. So bear that in mind as the standards get written. You'll get the people reading them that don't understand what the stuff is, and how well does the standard stand on its own as a reference document, because as regulations come out, as an Energy Star program for data centers starts up, just like when we write standards, the first thing you do is look at what else is already out there so you don't reinvent the wheel, so you continue to use stuff that's already, references that are already in use. So as you're developing the standards, contributing to that future list of references for a regulation or an incentive program. So, bear in mind you may need things in those standards that aren't immediately necessary to your end goals for having written it, because if you don't write that section for test procedures, someone will have to make it up later. So I don't want to belabor that. I'll keep moving here. So talked about that. I think I covered it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. One thing I wanted to do for the audience was, and for those of you from the UK, I apologize for this illusion. I did not want to be Paul Revere yelling the redcoats were coming in the form of the regulations are on their way. It's really not the purpose of what the discussion was meant to be about. What it really was meant to be about was you realize that regulations are on the way. I mean, we all know pretty much, we've been working in the industry for a while. Those of us who worked for the Energy Star program, RJ, where are you? who've worked with all of these programs, we know because we've been involved. And then we see the Energy Star programs kind of evolve into other programs, and then they kind of get shared globally as a tool. Well, this is how we start our future. When we talk about advancing resource efficiency, we have to start somewhere. That generally comes from how do we make these measurements? How do we do this the same way regardless of where in the world we're making this quote-unquote measurement? And so we start our bridge in the basis of the measurement. As we start constructing that bridge all along, then regulations do show up. But we all have this, and I borrowed this from Henry, we all have this philosophy where we like to test once and ship it anywhere. Well, the answer really is for products, you want to test once and ship it anywhere. But the flip side of this argument is you want to be able to measure the same way, whether it's in Singapore, Hawaii, Japan, European Union, wherever else, and you want to know that when you've built this bridge into the future, that construct of I've made the most efficient or close to the most efficient, and I'm doing these comparisons, that they're all the same. Well, that's what regulations enable. So the standards enable a portion of this work. The regulations provide us the baseline for where the future is really going to go with respect to data centers. So as we're advancing resource efficient IT, we're doing it through standards bodies first. We're doing it through organizations like the Green Grid, who start with our harmonization of metrics activities, where we start getting agreement across the industries, across the organizations. And then we have organizations like SC39 who enable the standards, create the standards, get them published and released. Everybody has a consensus. This is the way we're going to move forward. And then finally, we see the governments come in and say, okay, this is the baseline, this is how you do it, and this is what we expect you to deliver. So with that, I thought I would open up to the audience if there are any questions that you'd like to ask the panel members. Do not be shy.
Yeah, there's one.
I'm sorry, please.
This morning we had a very excellent presentation from eBay, which associated the expense and the cost of power and cooling with the actual why it is done so, right? I was actually leading the idle power work group for when the first Energy Star came out. So I'm very familiar with the regulation that went through that. One thing that still keeps on bothering me, probably I'm harping Chris's point more often. Just like the eBay did, they put an association with the cost, with the benefit. Similarly, when we talk about the data center, particularly they demand large amount of energy, there need to be some association about what they are there for. So for example, remove all the data center from the world today. How many trips to the banks people will do? How many trips to the stores they would do? Now you would think that how am I going to get that information? I think we can start with the information like eBay, how many transactions they are doing, right? How many, all these companies they are publishing, how many online transactions they are occurring. So you can start associating some kind of a benefit on the carbon footprint that these data centers or all these e-transactions are occurring. And I think then when the regulations come about, there need to be some kind of a balance there. I'm not saying there should not be regulation. I think we need to have some standards so we keep on improving. But needs to be some balance regarding why people are investing in the data center, why they are investing in the servers, or why they are spending probably 5 megawatts more here, but maybe reducing carbon footprint by using the cars with that amount of energy per large amount of way. So are there any discussions going on in that way? Or?
You're looking for it.
Well, I would say within SC39, we haven't hit that spot yet. When I heard the eBay presentation this morning, my thought at the end of it was they made a really difficult problem look easy. Just within a company, And then to try and, you talk about up-leveling the discussion, and when you do a standard, then you have to really up-level it because it can't be specific to, a technology or a company or a business model or that sort of thing. I'm still thinking about how to apply that specific thing, how you would actually do an international standard at that level. And we see the same thing. And the gentleman from Google also made a really good point in that not all workloads or transactions are created equal.
Right.
And we even run into that I don't want to get too granular, but I spend about 2/3 of my time in cloud computing standards, and we run into exactly the same problem of trying to standardize things there, is that the variety of things that people do in a data center or using cloud services, it gets so diverse that it's hard to describe all of those with, a paragraph of requirements or suggestions in a standard. But your point's taken, and it's certainly a thing that we'll probably look at over time.
It's a conversation that we've gotten involved in on some other standards, not on data center, but in some other areas, and trying to walk government policymakers through the fact that a standard isn't necessarily ready yet for a broad application across different uses and industries. And then secondly, that it may be a standard that even has proven itself to be useful in a certain way, say of how I can judge whether I'm making progress in increasing my energy efficiency, but still not ready to actually be used as a way to cut out through a mandatory reg, cut out the bottom 25%, say, of the product. That there's real danger in misusing a standard either before it's ready or misusing it in a way that it wasn't designed for.
I agree with that. Probably very largely. Simply, when we were looking at some of the Energy Star standards for UPS, fortunately, there was a standard available for us to go use. It defined the methodology for how you do measurements and things like that and we were able to provide that to the Energy Star program and tell them, this is what we would do. When the server standard was getting created, or the server requirement for Energy Star was first getting created, and they actually started talking about using a benchmarking tool. Which one? How many are there, Henry? 20, 25 different tools? Different methodologies for measuring relative benchmarking of a server's performance. And the load depends on whether it's a web server, print server, all of those different things. So to the point that was made, there is a cycle time that it is way too early to adopt a standard because the definition isn't precise enough to allow universal application in the marketplace. And there are times when it is. And it's a delicate balance the governments play, or not really play, but they take the measure of when they start to move forward on the regulations.
So just as a follow-on over here,
Yes.
What eBay I thought they made very clear is that they weren't developing a standard of transactions. They were standardizing a methodology for measurement. So Google completely didn't understand the problem set. That, yeah, all transactions are created differently, but it's a methodology for how do you baseline. So baseline your Gmail open transactions. I mean, you saw with the eBay, even the buy side and the sell side were very different transaction mixes, and they were combining it. So it's a methodology, and I think that's one of the keys that always happens in the standardization area, is that it standardizes something very specific, and by the time it's a standard, it's useless, and it's already out the door. So a methodology for how do you set a baseline and then improve from that baseline. It's really, that's what you're really trying to accomplish, right? Improvement over the baseline. And then you can use those improvements and that gradual time improvement to then show, to this gentleman's point, how that compares to how business was done previously and what the carbon offsets are and what the energy savings are.
Hi. One of the points that was raised earlier in your conversation was about worrying about technical innovation. One of the challenges I see, 10 years ago, a terabyte of disk storage took up a cabinet that was about 1 meter high by about 1/2 meter wide and 1/2 meter deep. Today, a terabyte takes up half of a disk that I can hold in one hand. How do we build standards and regulations from those standards that don't discourage that innovation? Because with that compactness came a 100-fold decrease or more in the energy consumption needed to power a terabyte. So we know we need to get more efficient. How do we build smart standards that allow us to keep the innovation that's made technology that goes into ICT so important continue to occur?
You or me? John, I was looking at you.
Well, I think one of the key methods is for a variety of stakeholders to be at the table so that all of those issues can be brought up, and it's definitely one of the things that makes standards today a lot harder to develop than I think maybe 15, 20 years ago. A long time ago, you could essentially take a snapshot of innovation that was probably pretty unique in the industry, and then use the standard to then drive it out, drive adoption. Today, innovation just happens so fast. It's very tied to business models.
Right.
It's tied to political agendas in some cases. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more things to think about in the development of a standard, and we certainly have seen that just in the work we've done in SC 39 that you and Jay and Henry have all been a part of. Is there's some pretty good ideas, but when you start turning over all the rocks of what about this and what about that, then it gets very difficult to say, well, we can apply this particular idea across the board. But my answer is if you have concerns, you got to come to the table and represent your concerns.
And the other thing I would say is that there is always room at the table for one more voice. One of the things that I have noticed in the participation within the standards development that I do is that there routinely is not enough voices at that table. There's routinely not enough people who are participating. It's not a matter of that there are insufficient good ideas. There are a lot of good ideas. There are insufficient channels to get those good ideas into the standard setting arena.
So another question here for the panel.
We had one more contribution, and then let me go to the next question.
It was just a very quick contribution. In addition, and I agree with what you've just said, to how standards are developed, it's also how they are used or how they are enforced. Sometimes you can use them, just to set performance limits, and then the market comes along with better solutions. So, the out-of-date stuff gets cut out automatically.
As I think about ICT as opposed to some other industries from a regulatory standpoint, there's innovation on refrigerators, washing machines, as well as ICT. But the refrigerator or the washing machine's functions basically staying the same, easy to define, easy to write regulations probably around those boundaries. As I watch what's happening in ICT, I don't feel like I can say that. As I think about the different parts of a data center and what the smart people in this room are teaching me as to the changes that are occurring, how are you going to continue to define and differentiate these different components and write standards and regulations to those components that are accurate, much less useful in the future? People in this room are smarter than me, but it just seems to me we've got some fundamental challenges that some other industries don't.
Yeah. So we had another question?
Yeah, so this is probably more of a comment and just a reaction from the panel based on the comment, but data center standards is an oxymoron. You're taking the life cycle of a data center. In many cases, if you look at software, it's maybe 18 months. If you look at hardware, it's It's maybe 2 years, tops 5 years for a lot of facilities. You look at a standard, and its life cycle is often 15 years at a minimum. By the time you go through the development, the adoption, the training, the enforcement, and the implementation of it, and then back around through the cycle again. So it's clear in my view that we are completely mismatching two things that will never slot together. They are truly a square and a round hole. It's not going to work. It never was built for this kind of change. So is the panel or any others in the room given consideration for let's stop creating standards groups and maybe focus on a different angle to the problem, because we know we're not going to change the standards development cycle and process, because those are things that are just baked in, based on ANSI, et cetera. And maybe we focus on a different area. And I don't know exactly what that is, but maybe it's just guidelines, or maybe it's just recommended practices, but something other than more standards, which, by the way, I know I'm guilty of furthering that as well, but just a question.
I'll follow up to that with a point I thought about adding on to the last series of comments, but didn't want to belabor it. One thing we deal with in regulations or in any incentive program like Energy Star is the idea that much like a bunch of people getting together and deciding to write more and more standards, is there's a climate of always continuing. And it is always worth considering, and I suggest to anyone who has the influence to, at the start of some project or program, to encourage those establishing the goal to also establish criteria for success, which is to say, when do you quit? My favorite classic example for that is in the 70s when EPECT 75 started the rule-making process for federal efficiency requirements, and one of the first products they hit was distribution transformers, large power transformers. And having not been encouraged to build efficient products before that, no one really ever cared, they had a lot of potential for improvement, and they saw double-digit improvements, 25% efficiency increase with the first rulemaking. Outstanding. Quads and quads and quads of energy saved. We're just about to get the final rule. It's a little overdue. For the latest rulemaking, the umpteenth iteration of distribution transformer standards, and those products before the rule were 97.4 to 99.1% efficient. And the federal government said, oh, there's room for more. We can get another quad out of those puppies. And they will over the national scale, the size of our grid and the amount of buildings and distribution and substation transformers and step down and step up and all that other stuff. But that's money and consultants and time of industry not spent on something where there might be that 20% to get. So when do you quit? If you're a legislatively mandated U.S. federal code laws telling you have to do rulemakings, the answer is never. And so that's a problem. So somewhat to that point is define success early and encourage people to stick to the plan.
So I might point out, and I have a rather long history in the electronics and ICT industry. There was a period of time, not too long ago, but it was more than a decade, but less than 3 decades, where I actually had to take power supplies and system and send them to almost 100 different jurisdictions for safety qualification and EMI testing, because of the 273 countries we shipped to, there were 270 variants of a safety cert or an EMI cert. There was no CISPR 22. There was, none of that stuff. There was no 6950-1 or any of that. And so we had individual requirements for all of these, and it cost a fortune to build all these prototypes and send them out. I submit it would cost a lot more than a fortune to have that kind of chaos exist for the data center marketplace, which is one of the reasons I think the standards enable probably more rapid change. They at least build a floor that you can stand on so you can go to the next level. I'm not so sure that standards are always the right way to approach a problem. In this particular case, I think that they enable a lot more than they take away. I would agree that standards development takes far too long, and I know because I've been picking on Henry about standards development and how long it's taken us to get some of the things in SC39 going. And of course, it's really easy to pick on Henry because I've known him for a long time. But the fact of the matter is that right now we have a series of tools in our box. That's one of the tools. As a faster, better tool becomes, I'm sure that we're prepared to adopt it. But right now, that's one of the tools. And I still believe that today, a lot of the standards are built on things that we've already done in the past, experiences we have, experience we know, and once we set those requirements, and then we can move forward on a different set of requirements. But those standards enable us to get traction, and they also enable us to be faster. And we just need to take advantage of that, because I believe there's a lot more similarities than there are differences in this area. But I agree, they still take too long to develop.
This will probably be the last question.
So how do you avoid perverse incentives, particularly in efficiency standards, where the free market is very good at avoiding perverse incentives, but efficiency standards have a tendency to create them. I can give an example of a router efficiency standard that measures watts per megahertz of the processor, which simply encourages me to design a router with a faster processor than necessary, or efficiency standards that say watts per for box function A and watts for box function B, that discourage me from building a combination box A-B that would be better for the consumer and for efficiency. So how can you avoid that trap in efficiency standards?
Go ahead, Alex.
A partial answer to that is to encourage a performance path, is what we call it in building codes. Performance path solution, the overall system must achieve a certain efficiency. And that allows the specifier or the designer or the owner-operator to find a way to get there without dictating specific parts. Another thing we encourage a lot in lighting that I do a lot of regulations for is what we term technology neutral standards. So it doesn't matter which way you get enough lumens per watt, just that you do. So those are two ways that maintain the floor for competition among different products and different features. It is difficult, especially when you're dealing with an entity that has a very, very high goal for energy efficiency, as I spoke before about commoditizing the stuff down. But that's one way, and making your voice heard early about that does help.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we've tried to do in our conversation with EPA on Energy Star is to talk through with them and make sure they're aware that the problem that you're citing exists there and will likely get worse as they try to look at standards not only for servers but also storage and large network equipment, and that they have to keep an eye out with us as to the bigger goal, which is the efficiency of the overall system or data center.
Yes.
I don't know if we came up with any solves yet, but we at least made sure that issue is in front of them, that they're aware of it, and they are ready to hear more from the industry as we see more problems occurring.
That's a great way to help close. Thinking about that point is looking at the data center as a very complex system. And that's been kind of the nature of more than a few questions here. Time to market, product life cycles. How long is IT gear on the marketplace as opposed to your refrigerator, following Chris's example? How do you prevent gaming the system? looking at this from a holistic perspective, much like the exercise we did with Gina's team at EPA. So I want to actually thank Colette specifically as really the only regulator here who's took the time to listen to the industry and gather additional perspective. So thank you very much, Colette, for taking that level of time. I'd also like to suggest, and Colette, through the EU Commission, Andre Royer, many of the folks that we have over in the EU, has been very committed to engaging with industry and considering what are the what-if scenarios. I heard a question a little bit earlier that was challenging, the component level or the micro perspective, but I really want to recognize what the EU's been doing. EU's been looking at this from a holistic system, and whereas standards may not work, EU's been very receptive to where are there broader considerations.
Right.
You heard Colette mention in the beginning of her presentation, standards may not always be the way. And they're even looking at what I heard you say was services in the ICT sector. And services may not necessarily require a standard in so much as a methodology of behavior and best practices. So we're over our time, but I did want to recognize the work that's been going on and thank the entire panel for their participation. Thanks.
Thank you.